Ready to quilt a unique flower design in your quilt borders? Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and we are planning and quilting a pretty flower border today. Now you can find all of the designs we're using in the Spring Flowers Quilt Stencil collection. You can find that at leahday.com/flower. So make sure to print out 4 copies of each corner design and 6 to 10 copies of the 3 border links, so you have plenty of pieces to play with. Cut out all of the shapes along the dashed lines and let's get started planning our border. A great place to start is our spring quilt panel I've designed for spoonflower fabric. You can check below the video for a link to pick up this spring quilt panel if you'd like to follow along step by step. Now our very first piece to place is our corner turn, and this is entirely up to you, especially on our spring quilt panel. Because we only are working on one basically 90-degree corner, you don't actually have to really worry about the corner too much. It's whichever one you like the best. So I'm going to pick this one, and this is our larger corner turn, and it extends down the sides of the quilt by 1 inch. So you can see how that fits right up against the inside edge of the quilt. And out here on the outside edge, I have a gray line and it says outer edge. That means the outer edge of the quilt. And you'll notice with the spoonflower panel, our outer edge is actually getting into the white of the quilt panel. So whenever you go to bind, make sure that you cut off the quilt a 1/4 inch into the white off of the printed pretty purple, and that way you're going to bind and you're not going to cut off your quilting design. So all you do is place the corner and then you just start planning out the border lengths. We've got 9-inch, 6-inch, and 3-inch border lengths. This way you can mix and match them together and pretty much fit any size of border. And it really is down to how you want it to look. And this is all based on your quilting opinion. If you look at it and you go, well, I want that flower to repeat. I want multiple flowers. Well, you're going to need to cut out more of the 6-inch pieces because they have the flower repeat in the center. So going ahead and just plan that out. When you get over here to this triangle corner, you're going to need to fold the paper away and cut it. But make sure to do this when you're actually quilting. And the reason is, as you're quilting, things can tend to shift. You might end up needing more or less of this piece than you actually think. Before you move to your machine, also make sure to snap a picture of it. Whatever you plan to do, you want to know what you planned and have all the pieces. If you have a really big border, you might want to even number them so that way you keep them in number order. Don't try and have the border pieces taped down to your quilt or pinned to your quilt. It just really doesn't end up working. Everything ends up shifting and it'll just make you crazy. So once you get it arranged, snap a picture of it and then take everything back off. And where we're going to get started, we're going to get started with that corner. So I've actually pulled up thread and started quilting on the corner. And this might be a little confusing for you. Why didn't I start all the way over here in the triangle area? And the reason is because of the triangle. Because of that shape being so weird, it might cause the entire row of stencils to shift, and then my nice large corner might not end up fitting. And I don't really like to overlap if I can help it, so I decided to just start on the corner. I'm going to stitch the entire corner design and then stitch up my quilt. And I think this is going to be a great way of getting started whenever you have, let's say, cornerstones on the border, or you have a situation where you really don't want overlapping stencils and you want to make sure that your corner is going to fit just exactly right. Now within the border design, you do have choices as far as when you hit and quilt certain things. So like right now, I could go inside and stitch the daisy first, or I could loop all the way around. I will hit that point a second time. Other things like these little teardrops, whenever I hit that point, I need to go ahead and stitch that because I won't hit that spot again. The more you get used to these stencils and get to know them, you get to know the design, the more you know, okay, I need to make sure that I hit that area so I don't accidentally miss it. So I've quilted my border, stop with my needle in the down position, and now I take that 9-inch piece that I plan to use and I'm just sliding it right up against the needle. You know, if something has shifted and this isn't quite lining up, allow yourself that little bit of a gap. Allow it to be just a little bit bigger through that one shape, and that's a-okay. Quilts are fluid. Fabric is constantly shifting, And you kind of just have to work with it and allow it to do what it's doing. But I think that even with that little bit of a gap, you can see, I think my corner shifted ever so slightly out of square with the corner. Still going to be a-okay. So I reached the end of my second 9-inch border, and now is the time when I grab my little 3-inch borders and I'm going to fit them into this triangle. And so I'm lining this up so that the inside edge of the quilt is lined up with that bottom edge of that border piece, and then I just take the whole thing and fold it over. So I stitch up to the area where I can get onto the stencil, just stitch onto that stencil, and then flow into it. So now I'll flow into the other line, the outline, and then now we'll cut our last triangle shape. And really all we need is just that little curve to keep it consistent with the rest of the design. Now let's talk through a situation where your corners really matter and you have to plan all 4 corners. In this case, I usually start with these small corner borders. You can see how these fit. They basically fill in the corner like a block, and the corner matches up with the corner of the inside of the quilt. Now this is a real quilt, so in this case you can see how the outer edge of the quilt lines up with the outer edge of the stencil, and that works all the way around. Make sure always to have that gray outer edge line on that outer edge, otherwise things are kind of not going to really work out all that well. So once you get your corners placed, then you can start playing around with what pieces are going to fit on the inside. So in this case, I have about 9.5 inches. So I could fit in 3 of these little 3-inch borders, and I could put a gap in between them, and that would look nice. I could also put in 1 of the 9-inch pieces and just put a bigger gap. And you kind of just got to look at this and make a decision based on how it looks and your opinion of how it looks, and decide, do you like a lot of little gaps between the stencils, or do you like just 2 bigger gaps? You know, little gaps look one way, big gaps look another way. Now, what if you wanted to reduce the gaps completely and even allow the stencils to overlap? And in this case, you're going to have to switch out your corners, because you can see anything that I try right now, 3, 6, or 9, I'm going to end up with gaps. So let's go on ahead and switch out just 2 of our corners. 2 diagonal corners switched out is going to add 1 inch to the sides of the quilt, because this larger corner extends into the side by 1 inch. That's the only real difference. Well, the design is a little bit different, obviously, but the larger corner border extends, and you can see you need to notch out that little corner there along the side of the inside of the quilt, and that's the major difference, is it's 1 inch bigger down the sides. When you add it on 2 opposite corners, 2 diagonal corners, you're going to add 1 inch to that side, add 1 inch to that side, add 1 inch to that side, and add 1 inch to that side. If you added the bigger corners to both sides, you would be adding 2 inches. So you can see how much that squishes the space down. In this particular case, if I went with the larger borders, I could then go with really big gaps and 1 of the 6-inch, and that would be probably about the best thing. Or I could go, I guess, with smaller gaps and 2 of these. So you can see how this is almost like a puzzle, and playing with it and figuring out what you like. That's kind of how I designed it. So that way you can just play and have fun with it. There's no right or wrong. You're not going to mess up your quilt. It's just looking at it and then making a decision of what do you like to look at on your quilt. So by adding those 2 diagonal borders, larger borders, now when I add my 9-inch, you can see it overlaps slightly. So I get an overlap ever so slightly on both corner stencils. And it's up to you how you decide to quilt this. The gap is actually a little bit easier to manage. Whenever you have a gap between stencils, all you're going to do is just remember, number 1, that you left a gap. You're going to keep the stencil spaced that way, and you're just going to stitch right across it, keeping a nice smooth curve. And that's it. You just continue the design. Whenever you do an overlap, you're going to stitch that first stencil, then place the stencil over it that's overlapping, and you're basically going to stitch from there and then basically pretend that that bottom stencil is not there. You may even want to rip the paper away so that way you don't end up with 2 layers of paper, which might be a little bit more difficult to rip away. So whenever you have an overlap, that's okay too. Just remember, you're going to stitch to the end of the stencil, then you're going to place your next stencil on top and stitch it, and then like in this case, the line would curve this way and it would curve this way. It would kind of look a little Venn diagram-esque, but it would not look bad. And please understand that there's no right or wrong way. And I hope that that really makes sense and is the number one thing that you take away from this is that these can be mixed and matched infinitely, and there isn't a wrong way to place them on your quilts. So that's it for this video. If you enjoy learning how to quilt with these flower quilting stencils and you'd like to give it a try, come and pick up your quilting collection at leahday.com/flower. Until next time, let's go quilt.